Gross-Rosen in the final phase of the war. By the autumn of 1944, the Gross-Rosen concentration camp system had evolved into one of the most lethal networks within Nazi Germany. Originally established as a labor camp, Gross-Rosen expanded rapidly as the war turned against the Third Reich. Its transformation into a complex of subcamps coincided with the mass evacuation of prisoners from camps in eastern territories threatened by the advancing Soviet army. Among the tens of thousands transferred were large numbers of women, many already weakened by prior imprisonment, disease, and prolonged malnutrition. Their arrival did not represent relocation for survival but rather entry into an environment structured to ensure physical destruction. Central to the camp's function was forced labor in granite quarries, where work conditions were deliberately engineered to exceed the limits of human endurance. Prisoners were compelled to extract and transport massive stone blocks under constant surveillance, regardless of age, gender, or physical condition. The labor was not intended to produce sustainable output. Instead, it served as a mechanism of attrition. The quarry became a site where exhaustion was inevitable and recovery impossible. Work quotas were enforced through violence, and failure defined as any slowing of pace was met with immediate punishment. Starvation was inseparable from labor. Daily rations, typically consisting of thin, nutritionally empty soup and a small portion of bread, provided far fewer calories than required for survival, let alone for intense physical exertion. Hunger was not a byproduct of neglect but a calculated tool of domination. Bodies rapidly deteriorated, muscle mass vanished, joints weakened, and internal organs failed under prolonged caloric deprivation. Prisoners were forced to carry loads that exceeded their own body weight, while their balance and strength deteriorated daily. The quarry environment compounded this destruction. Granite dust filled the air and settled deep in the lungs, accelerating respiratory failure in bodies already compromised by starvation and disease. There was no protective equipment, no medical oversight, and no allowance for rest. Beatings were frequent and arbitrary, administered not as disciplinary correction but as reinforcement of absolute control. Guards struck prisoners without provocation, conveying that weakness itself constituted a punishable offense. In this system, the human body was treated as a disposable resource, consumed until it collapsed. Medical care was effectively non-existent. Those who fell during labor were often left unattended, their fate determined by whether they could still stand during roll call. Survival depended less on health than on the ability to remain visibly alive. The camp administration did not require complex killing technologies to achieve mass death. Within the Gross-Rosen concentration camp system, starvation was not merely a condition of imprisonment but a deliberate and systematic method of punishment and elimination. Food deprivation functioned as a central instrument of control, shaping every aspect of daily existence. Rations were calculated to sustain prisoners just long enough to continue working while ensuring the steady deterioration of their bodies. Hunger governed behavior, distorted time, and reduced survival to a daily calculation of endurance. The physical effects of prolonged starvation were immediate and relentless. Prisoners experienced rapid loss of muscle mass, leaving limbs thin and unsteady. Legs trembled under minimal strain, spines bent forward, and joints lost their capacity to bear weight. Tasks that once required strength became impossible as bodies weakened from within. Balance failed while carrying heavy stone, leading to frequent falls that were often fatal. Hunger eroded not only physical capacity but also resistance to disease, rendering even minor infections deadly. Psychological deterioration accompanied physical collapse. Constant hunger narrowed consciousness to the pursuit of food, while exhaustion diminished the ability to think beyond the present moment. Prisoners became acutely aware of the fragility of their own bodies and of those around them. Emaciation was visible everywhere, transforming the camp into a landscape of skeletal figures whose survival depended on their ability to continue moving despite overwhelming weakness. The guards interpreted physical decline as moral failure, reinforcing the Nazi ideology that equated strength with worth and weakness with disposability. Violence served to reinforce starvation's effects. Guards beat prisoners not to correct specific infractions but to assert dominance over bodies already breaking down. Blows were delivered without warning, often targeting those who struggled to keep pace. Weakness itself was treated as an offense. There was no mechanism for medical intervention, and no attempt to preserve life once a prisoner could no longer function as labor. Those who collapsed were frequently left where they fell, their fate determined by how long they remained conscious or capable of standing during inspections. Within this environment, acts of sharing food carried extraordinary risk. Bread represented survival itself. Surrendering even a small portion could mean the difference between life and death. Yet many prisoners, particularly women, continued to divide their rations with those visibly dying of illness or exhaustion. These actions were not symbolic gestures but tangible sacrifices that shortened the giver's life expectancy. They occurred quietly, beyond the view of guards, and often without acknowledgement. Such acts of compassion constituted a form of moral resistance. In a system designed to reduce individuals to biological units of labor and disposal, the choice to share food asserted the persistence of human agency. These moments preserved social bonds and affirmed ethical values that the camp sought to erase. While starvation functioned as a tool of annihilation, it also revealed the limits of total control. Even as bodies deteriorated, the capacity for solidarity endured, fragile yet profoundly significant in an environment engineered to destroy both physical life and moral identity. By late 1944, Gross-Rosen had reached a stage in which the distinction between life and death was no longer clearly defined. The cumulative effects of starvation, forced labor, disease, and sustained violence reduced prisoners to a condition in which survival became increasingly ambiguous. Bodies were so severely emaciated that even fellow inmates struggled to determine whether those lying beside them were still alive. Breathing slowed to barely perceptible movement, and consciousness faded in and out, creating a state in which existence itself appeared provisional. The camp environment normalized this ambiguity. Prisoners who could no longer rise for work were often left where they collapsed, neither formally declared dead nor provided assistance. Roll calls became moments of silent judgment, in which the ability to stand upright, however briefly, determined continued existence. Those unable to do so were removed or simply disappeared. Death rarely arrived as a sudden event. Instead, it unfolded gradually through organ failure, infection, and exhaustion. The process was visible, prolonged, and relentless. Unlike extermination camps equipped with gas chambers, Gross-Rosen relied on methods that required no specialized infrastructure. Hunger, exposure, and labor served as sufficient instruments of killing. This approach blurred the moral and administrative boundaries between labor exploitation and mass murder. Death could be attributed to natural causes, such as disease or weakness, masking the intentional nature of the system. In reality, the camp's design ensured that most prisoners would not survive long-term confinement. The absence of gas chambers did not indicate restraint but rather reflected an alternative model of destruction, one that operated continuously and with devastating efficiency. Indifference played a crucial role in sustaining this system. The guards' refusal to intervene, combined with their active enforcement of brutal conditions, created an environment in which death was neither exceptional nor noteworthy. Corpses were removed with the same routine as waste, reinforcing the perception that prisoners had ceased to exist as human beings. The normalization of death eroded empathy not only among perpetrators but also among prisoners themselves, who were forced to suppress emotional responses in order to survive. Yet even in this state of extreme degradation, the presence of human connection endured. Prisoners recognized one another's suffering, offered comfort when possible, and bore witness to deaths that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Memory became an act of resistance. To remember those who died, to recognize their individuality and suffering, challenged the camp's attempt to erase identity entirely. Gross-Rosen demonstrated that genocide did not require immediate or mechanized killing to be effective. The camp functioned as a space of slow annihilation, where death was produced through exhaustion, neglect, and deliberate deprivation. By the time liberation approached, countless lives had already been extinguished through a process that was systematic, visible, and profoundly dehumanizing. The legacy of Gross-Rosen lies not only in the number of deaths it produced but in the method itself, a reminder that mass murder can occur through sustained indifference as surely as through overt violence. The history of Gross-Rosen reminds us that humanity can survive even in the darkest systems of cruelty. When power is built on dehumanization, even the smallest act of compassion becomes an act of resistance. Remembering such histories is not only about honoring the dead, but about recognizing our responsibility to prevent silence, indifference, and injustice in the present. If this story helped you understand history more deeply, please like, share, and subscribe to support meaningful content and keep these memories alive.